Hello, thanks for joining me. I am your everyday average Jonathan, an ordinary guy with ordinary tools making extraordinary things. This week we'll be making a walnut and aspen cutting board or serving tray, depending on how you look at it. Let's get to the shop and get started. I am a self-taught craftsman, an amateur blacksmith, and a novice woodworker. The things that I make each week are whimsical, fantastical, and often echo times of forgotten yore. Items like weapons, armor, furniture, and practical items that I use every day on my ranch here in Colorado. Each week I take on a new project where I will show you my perspective, my process, and my hard-won lessons learned. I don't edit out any of my aha moments, and I do not edit out any of my mistakes. So I bought this piece of walnut off of Facebook Marketplace for $30. I saw this idea for doing a big wood inlay, a natural wood inlay into a slab of walnut off of a video on the internet. And the person who did it did a really outstanding job, and I thought, well, I could probably do the same, but if I'm going to do this, I want to find a really interesting piece of wood that's gnarled and curled. So I have this piece of aspen that I had laying around my shop for a long time. Looked like the perfect piece, but I found that cutting aspen can be very difficult and oftentimes fraught with breaks and cracks here and there, so I had to do a lot of aggressive sanding to get it back together. After I traced the outline of the aspen on the walnut, then it was time for me to take the router and go ahead and mill out probably about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more of 1/4 of an inch in that exact outline. I've done this sort of router work quite a bit with wood inlays on tables of other sorts, and it usually goes pretty well. Just applying a little bit of glue, going to go ahead and make sure that I clamp these down nice and tight, leave them overnight, come back and check the work. They glued up real well overnight, but one of the big mistakes I made on this piece was how I attached these end pieces and how I measured them. I screwed that up and I eyeballed it and measured it a few times, but I still got it wrong. I kind of live and die by my angle grinder in most of my projects. Here I'm using an 80 grit sanding wheel, and it just removes so much material, so much sawdust left over. As you can see, the shop was just filled with dust. I don't have a dust collection system. I wish that I did, but it's a leaf blower. And now it's the time to epoxy on those end pieces, as you can see, and I'll go ahead and clamp those up, and again I'll leave those overnight as well. Due to the offset nature of this piece, it's not square. I had to put a little screw in here so that the clamp could get purchased and go ahead and clamp those tight for the night. Now I'm just attaching each end piece, getting a clamp on it, and going to leave it overnight so that it sets up nice and tight. Here I'm measuring up where I'm going to make some wrought iron handles. These handles are going to be made from these parts from a really large giant wire spool that someone gave to me. And now I'm sanding down the end pieces of those pieces of branch that I epoxied earlier. There are some cracks in the ends that I needed to cover up with sawdust. You'll see that in a little bit there. Here I screwed this up. This was sawdust that I thought was the right tinge, the right color, but it just wasn't, and it showed up in the cracks later. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to go ahead and get those shaped into handles, but I'm also going to put a twist into them so that there's a little bit of character in each of these handles. It's not just a straight piece of metal. And one thing I've learned is that when you're twisting metal, you want it to have some ridges, some definition, meaning if it's perfectly round, it's not going to really show up all that well. So flattening it beforehand, if it's a round piece, is going to give you more definition to the twists. And here I am just making out the handle forms. I am a self-taught blacksmith, amateur blacksmith. No one ever said I was excellent at it, so there's a lot of unforced error and replication that goes on, having to heat things up multiple times. But I love it. It's a great learning process every single time. And now I'm just going to go ahead and cool the hose down so I can keep working on them. Hitting these quickly with the wire wheel, it just removes the scale, removes the rime, gives it a nice shiny look. Not too shiny, but it's good enough for what I'm going to do. One of my, what I would call a trade secret for me, is when I'm using items like this in metal, I do a lot of coating metal with polyacrylic or polyurethane, mostly polyacrylic because it's clear and it doesn't tarnish, but it's a great way to have a low sheen protective coating on your pieces of metal. I'm going to dress this up a little bit more with some finer and finer grit sandpaper. I went down to about 600 grit sandpaper, although on the edges I think I only did 200 grit. I didn't want to get them super smooth, more natural. And here my little helper and I, we're going to do what's called water popping, which is a way to clean up the sawdust off of the top of the piece, but also then come back in with water to get that grain to really pop out before I apply the epoxy to it. And now we are ready for the all-important taping. We're going to put epoxy into this and we're going to make it pigmented. I have a nice green color of pigment here that I'm going to go use as the inlay in the epoxy. And on to the epoxy. I did this in the house because it's warmer in the house and the epoxy doesn't like to mix very well when it's colder environment, and it was 50 something degrees in my shop. The pigment that I'm using is kind of a malachite green. It's a little bit greener, a little bit thinner than a malachite green, but upon pouring it on, it took to the seams really, really well. I had a very interesting thing happen where the first batch of this I made, it got so hot that it actually melted the solo cup and solidified, so I had to mix up a whole new batch. And here's my first batch that I had. It's rock solid in there in the course of a handful of minutes. I actually put it in the freezer because it got so hot, but that didn't save it. The chemical reaction was too profound. I lost the whole thing. All right, time to take the tape off and see what we're dealing with. I love the color of that green. It's going to really pop between the white, clear aspen and that ruddy brown walnut. I use a little lap wheel because it's not quite as aggressive as my sandpaper that I would normally use on this. It takes off the epoxy and at the same time doesn't destroy the wood too badly. And right now I'm going to have to redo most of the surface sanding because that flap wheel basically took off all of the finer sanding that I did earlier, which is just an oversight on my part. I'm going to bevel off the edges, just a slight rounding, a 1/4 inch rounding bit in my router, just so it gives a little bit nicer feel. I decided not to do an epoxy coating on the top after I had applied that color. I thought that would just be a little bit too shimmery, so I came in with my trusted polyacrylic right now and just gave it a first coat, and then I'm going to go in and actually paint on some thicker solution. I have some walnut colored wood filler, which doesn't look like walnut if you ask me. Here I'm just doing some touch-ups with the clear finish that I'm going to use, that polyacrylic, just making sure that certain spots are filled. There were some bubbles here and there. Getting my chisels nice and sharp because I'm going to need them. I made a mistake on my measuring, which I alluded to earlier, and I just don't like the way one of those end pieces looked. It had a very odd overlap. I'm going to take care of it now, just making sure my chisels are razor sharp. And here you are. The overlap on the end piece, it came out way too strong. It's just the way I measured it poorly. So I'm going to go ahead and chisel that out and reapply the epoxy. Little bit hair raising at this part, hoping that I don't make a big split. I thought I did a pretty good job. I was trying to be careful, which is not my strong suit, but it did actually come out as one piece, and that worked out pretty well. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to try to capture some of the whiter aspen sawdust to apply it to the seam cracks that I didn't get to fill very correctly. So I'm just going to sand off as much as I can and capture it in that little cap there. And I've done this before and it's worked out well. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, this particular crack just always showed up as obvious. I put in epoxy first and then sawdust and it still didn't work, and I did it the other way. It didn't work there either. Here's my lovely tiger maple that I use a lot of. I'm going to make little feet, little footings that go underneath it, little dowels. Every now and then I think I come up with a decent idea on how to get certain things accomplished, and with this one I couldn't get the angle on my sander down correctly, so I actually ended up putting that piece into a drill and just bringing it over and firing up the drill directly onto the sander, and it worked really well. Now it's time to just go ahead and pre-drill all the holes for the 4-footers. I'm also using, as I often do, old hardware, old flathead hardware, or oftentimes I use square head lag screws, but in this one I wanted the countersunk flathead screws to be able to go in there without touching the surface. I do like the idea, after I get done leveling this, of if someone looks underneath at the wood footers, they see this beautiful tiger maple for those wood footers. And here I'm just going to take some more of that polyacrylic and kind of lacquer it on very thickly into the natural live edge spots. There's 2 spots on this, on both sides of this cutting board. I have to admit, I have a little bit of paranoia about this piece of live edge bark coming off of this, because walnut bark can just peel off oftentimes, so I was very thick with the coatings I did here. And then the top coating is the same polyacrylic, just laid it on pretty thick. It's not pure gloss, it's a satin finish, but it came out looking pretty glossy either way. I'm going to finish up the bottom side with a little bit more of that spray polyacrylic, and then it's time to put on the handles. I do use old world hardware, if you will. These are pyramid head lag screws that you can get off of the internet. There's also square head lag screws that I collect and that you can get off the internet. I just like that ethos, that whole effect of the old world craftsmanship that they seem to bring about. And then lastly, the all-important artist touch mark, my initials, burnt into the wood itself. You'll have to forgive me on the cheesy background. I was playing with green screens, and I still haven't got it quite down yet, but I'm getting pretty close. All in all, I think this came out pretty good. I give myself about a B grade on it. The end pieces of each of the aspen didn't look quite the way that I wanted it to, and you can see that overlap in the green epoxy. The accent looks nice, but at the same time, I know it's there. I know that it was a mistake, so that's what I see. But all in all, I'm pleased with it. I'll be making probably 1 or 2 more similar to this. Thank you for joining me this week. That was a very fun build. I will be selling that cutting board on my Etsy page. A couple things that I learned. First off, measure once, cut twice. I believe that's how they say it. No, measure twice, cut once. I made some mistakes early on that I could have avoided by just taking a better look at things. I learned that not all epoxies are equal. Fast set epoxies, the epoxy gels, could be good for certain things, but they're not good for others. I also learned that aspen is a very soft wood, and when it comes to sanding it and trimming it down, it would move material much faster than the surrounding walnut pieces, and I had to take account for that several times. I also learned that when applying sawdust into the cracks of the piece of material, either applying the epoxy first and then the sawdust into the cracks, or applying the sawdust first and then the epoxy into the cracks. One of those is better than the other. Clearly I didn't learn very well because I don't remember which one was better, but one of them worked and the other one didn't really work better. Next week, I will be making a commission that I received for a pair of throwing knives, and I will be doing so in the average everyday Jonathan format, which is a combination of traditional and my own style on things. So looking forward to showing you that process. We'll see you soon.